Shibley Telhami, for the motion.
Good evening. I think America should stand for democracy and freedom. I think it should be an inspiring model, as it has been historically. What we shouldn't be doing is trying to pretend like we're capable of making spreading democracy a top priority in a world in which we face many threats, and certainly not to do it by force. I think if you look at what has happened over the past 5 years as a consequence of this policy of spreading democracy by force, is that we have a public in the Arab world that doesn't believe us. We have governments that don't believe us. We have less democracy, more anarchy, more instability, more terrorism, and even worse, a growing American dependence on the very institutions and the very governments that need to be reformed. In essence, we have given democracy a bad name. It is hard for people in the region, including people who badly and desperately are looking for democracy and freedom, to think of democracy and freedom the American way without thinking about the horrors of Iraq. We have paid a price by diverting attention from the important issue of human rights, which we often confuse with spreading democratic systems. That issue, which we should trump and advocate, has paid a price as a consequence of this policy. Let me begin with some of the facts. The vast majority of people in the Arab world, all polls show, do not believe that we mean to spread democracy in the Middle East. Most of them believe that we're in Iraq and in the region for oil, Israel, and weakening the Muslim world. Even the governments who have faced pressures from us, and yes, they have faced pressures, and yes, they have been told to liberalize, all have believed that this is essentially tactical, that this is done in order to coerce them to cooperate on strategic issue or as a political domestic issue to divert attention from the absence of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And as a consequence, they dealt with it tactically. They said, the president needs it a little politically, give him a little election so he can say, I've got more democracy in Libya, I've got more democracy in Saudi Arabia. And then once he claims that he has a success, he's not going to claim it as a failure the next day, and then you can go on with business and look at the reality that we have at the moment. The vast majority of people in the Middle East, when you poll them, those people whom we're supposed to be giving democracy to, the vast majority believe that the Middle East is less democratic today than it was before the Iraq War. Less democratic today than it was before the Iraq War, and it was horribly undemocratic before the Iraq War, no doubt. And how is that the case? Is this simply made up by the media? Is this what people tell them? Is this what leaders tell them? I'm afraid there's a little bit of reality to that, and we now see it in many of the places that we celebrated early on as examples of democracy. Remember the three big examples, Iraq, Lebanon, and the Palestinian areas, and you look at where we are in these areas. But separate from that, there is some other dynamic that goes on that we are not coming to grips with, something that our policy does, because in reality, we are not making democracy our priority, and we, in essence, deceive ourselves when we think we are. Let me give you an example. 90% of the Arab public passionately opposed the Iraq War, didn't want to see it take place. They told the governments, don't do it, it's going to bring about ruins. Their government's instinct was, don't support the Iraq War. But when we went to the Iraq War, these governments are certainly dependent on the US. In the end, they came along and they provided logistical support and bases and everything else. And they were telling us that they're worried about their public opinion. Well, it was more important for us that they support our policies on terrorism, on Iraq, on the Arab-Israeli issue, despite the anger of the people, than the liberalization. What happens in the process? How is the Jordanian government or the Egyptian government or the Saudi government going to face up with that pressure that comes from the public at a time of war? What they do is they unleash security services. Yes, they have elections, and by the way, some of those elections we've had as little as 20% and possibly only 10% of the public participating. It tells you how seriously people took it. But in the end, these governments became more repressive in order to put down any possible opposition given the anger of the public. And this is essentially what we do, even in the war on terrorism. Who do we think are most important allies in these countries? It's not the Democrats. Yes, the Democrats, we theoretically want to empower them. But who do we give most aid to? With whom do we institutionally cooperate? The security services, who are in bed with our security services, the military, which are in bed with our military. These are the institutions of the repressions that need to be reformed, but those are the ones we have to deal with. And I'm not saying we don't need to deal with them. We have to deal with them. But the reality of it is that the consequence is perpetuating repression, increasing it, even as we pretend to be promoting it. Let me just make a couple of points to end. One is that I believe that all people in the world, and all Arabs and all Muslims, want to see freedom and democracy. No one likes dictatorship. And yes, I don't think they want a different kind of democracy and freedom. When I ask them, name 2 countries where there's most freedom and democracy for their people, they name primarily Western countries, Western Europeans and the US. They know what democracy and freedom are. People aspire to it. But one thing they don't want is they don't want anarchy. They want anarchy even less than they want democracy. And they want to see no occupation. They want freedom, but they want to avoid anarchy, and they want to avoid occupation. And when they see what is going on in Iraq, if a leader in Egypt looks at their citizen and say, do you want Cairo or do you want Baghdad? I want Cairo over Baghdad any day of the week with all the pain that people face every day. And that is the reality of how the choices are seen in the region. Let me end by saying I am not in harmony with the view that we shouldn't advocate democracy. I think we need to advocate democracy. But I believe that there is a better way. I think we should focus on those issues over which there is international consensus, like human rights. We should hold people responsible to treaties that they have signed, and in order for us to be powerful in that regard, we have to uphold our end of the bargain. We have to be an inspiring model, not just lecture to people while we have the Abu Ghraib prison, and we need to work in economic reform because that is the structure that enables true democracy to emerge from within. We're treating Arab as a passive people that need to be told from the outside. No, they need empowerment from the outside, not manipulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shibley Telhami.